Do note that the incorrect examples are exaggerated on purpose so that the issues are easier to see. In my opinion, the correct examples do properly show what they are meant to show. However, they are in no way perfect. As an exercise, see if you can spot issues with my form in the correct examples. If you do, go and leave a comment down below. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at thrusting. Now, you might think that thrusting is not cutting, and you would be right. However, there is a clear difference on how a training sword and how a sharp sword behave on a thrust. My goal is not to only teach you to cut, but also to teach you to use a sword in a martially viable way. This is why I decided to dedicate an episode to thrusting. We won't be going too deep into the subject of thrusting, as that is outside of the scope of this series. What we are taking a look at is the basic body mechanics required for a good thrust, and the differences between thrusting with a blunt training tool and a sharp sword. Without further ado, let's discuss how thrusting with sharp swords and blunt training tools differs from each other. The clear difference is that with a blunt training tool, a thrust is a space-creating attack. With a sharp sword, a thrust is a space-diminishing action. Let me clarify. Training tools are designed to be relatively safe. Because of this, they cannot penetrate into anything you thrust. Because of this, there are only few things which can happen. Either the target must move away from you, or the blade must bend. Usually, the end result is a combination of both. What is common with both of these situations is that the training weapon is trying to push your target away from you. Even when the blade bends, it can only stop your target, slip off of your target, or break. It is not uncommon to have a solid thrust with a feather to push over even an advancing opponent. I have thrust advancing opponents out of the ring in competitions, and I have seen multiple similar situations. Naturally, this only happens when your training tool doesn't break and your structure doesn't collapse. It is rather normal to purposefully let your structure collapse when drilling or in friendly sparring. It makes the thrust feel much less nasty in the receiving end, and it reduces the chance of injury in general. A word of caution. If you always let your structure collapse, you will learn to do it every single time, whether you wanted to or not. Naturally, this is not a good thing from a martial perspective. You should learn to thrust with a proper structure and only let it collapse when you want it to happen. I will not go into detail about this, but here is a simple example. When doing thrusting drills with your partner, do not default to letting your structure collapse. Instead, regulate the impact of the thrust in different ways. Thrust from far enough that you only go in 10 to 15 centimeters. Don't step in too fast. The partner can lessen the impact by leaning away on the impact. Do this only after the point has come into contact. Once again, this is barely touching the surface on the subject as it is out of the scope of this series. Now, when thrusting with a sharp sword, the thrust is a space-diminishing action. You have to step in to make the thrust. You can technically maintain distance if you are thrusting to a close target by simply extending your arms. In this specific case, with a training tool, this would still be a space-creating action, whereas with a sharp weapon, this is a space-maintaining action. There is also the case in which you thrust to a very resistive material with a sharp sword, such as thrusting to a good breastplate or even a good gambeson-backed mail. In this case, a sharp sword would behave mostly like a training tool, with the exception that most sharp swords flex significantly less than any training tool. But let's get back to the interesting situation in which our sharp sword penetrates into our target. At this point, you might think that you have successfully completed your thrust and everything is great. However, if your target is a human, they are probably still very much alive. And they are probably still able to act, at least for a little while. And your sword is pretty much useless, as it's still inside your target. If you have not prepared for it, defending yourself against even a single attack can be extremely difficult. So, let's take a closer look at that situation. In the worst case, your sword is now stuck. It might be because you thrust through some rather unfortunately resistive target and it caught on your sword. Or maybe your target rotated, wedging the sword in, making it impossible to retrieve it. I will be talking more about this in the Retrieving the Sword section. In the very worst case, your sword gets stuck and your target turns, pulling the sword out of your hands. With all of the following, we are trying to make this not to happen. However, do understand that it might indeed happen and you should try to minimize the risk of it. If the sword is not hopelessly stuck, we have basically two options. Retrieve the sword, in other words, pull it out, or try to run it all the way to the hilt or close enough. We could technically just leave it where it is, but then we would be in a similar situation to having our sword stuck. One reason for why we don't want to leave the sword where it is that this makes it very difficult for you to defend yourself. With a blunt training tool, you can complete a thrust and then wind to defend yourself. When your sharp sword is inside something, not so much. In theory, it might still be possible to wind in some capacity while the sword is in the target, especially if you didn't penetrate too far. However, this is not always the case, and we want to prepare for the worst instead of hoping for the best. Because of that, our options basically are to run the target through or pull the sword out. Do note that I count abandoning the sword and going for grappling the same as running the target through. To run your target through, you need to have a proper structure and to use your body weight to drive the sword through the target. In simpler terms, have a proper structure and step towards your target. This can also happen accidentally if you overreach with your thrust, or if your target is advancing towards you while you thrust. This is a very likely situation, especially with counter thrusts. Do note that the sword doesn't necessarily get stuck immediately. It might only get stuck after you have already decided to run the target through and you are 3/4 of your sword inside your target. This simply means that you are now in the situation that, well, your sword is stuck. Then retrieving the sword. There will be a whole section dedicated for this later in the episode, so I will not talk more about this right now. Let's just say that, in my opinion, this is the option you should aim for most of the time. Running things through definitely has its uses, but retrieving the sword if possible is, in my opinion, the safer and more versatile option. Before we get to retrieve our sword, we need to first get it into our target. So let's take a basic thrusting technique. Before we get more in depth with basic thrusting theory, a comment on martial application. These exercises do not take into account covering yourself with the thrust. We will be doing simple centerline thrusts from the low guard. From the high guard, we will be having our hands off the center line, but we are not actually concentrating on covering an attack line with the sword. In martial context, you would always want to thrust in opposition. In other words, you want to thrust in a way in which you cover the shortest attack line or the most likely attack line from your opponent. This doesn't matter that much as the basic theory stays the same, but do remember that in a martial context you would want to thrust a bit differently. One reason is that such theory is outside the scope of this series. As thrusting is only a very small part of cutting training, I want to keep it to a single episode. The second reason is that thrusts where the blade is completely vertical and at center work the best when done against tatami. This is because the grain in rolled tatami runs vertically, and it can be surprisingly resistant against thrusts which are made with a sword at an angle. As the mat is only pegged at the bottom, this can easily cause the mat to simply bend over, even though the thrust is actually good. Based on this, I saw limiting the conversation to centered thrusts with a vertical blade as a good compromise. I also recommend that you do not start thrusting to cutting media with a sharp sword before you watch the retrieving the sword section, which comes immediately after this one. But now, let's get to the actual thrusting theory. When you are thrusting, you want to have the sword to move in a straight line. In the starting position, the sword should be already pointing at what the thrust is aimed at. This is important because if you need to move the point around while you are thrusting, it becomes exponentially more difficult to actually hit what you are aiming at. Even when you are moving your hands, the point should be always aimed at your target. And do note, I'm not talking about the target as in your opponent, I'm talking about the target as in the point in your opponent at which you are aiming at. For example, their face. From here we get to how longswords tend to handle. At least this is how every single longsword I have ever handled is balanced. This goes for sharps, feathers and synthetics alike. Your dominant hand moves the sword around so that the point stays in place. Depending on the sword, the point which stays in place might be a bit forwards or backwards from the point, but it should be very close to it. Your non-dominant hand moves the point around. This allows you to change target, go around your opponent's sword, and other such actions. The important thing here is that to keep the point in place, you want to use your dominant hand to move the sword. To move the point around, you want to use your non-dominant hand. If you have difficulties keeping the point in line during a thrust, it is most likely caused by your non-dominant hand. As with cutting, we want to have full extension when we come in contact with the thrust. This way, when thrusting against resistive materials, we don't need to use our weak arm muscles, but instead we can use our body weight to drive the point in. In addition to this, moving your arms first has a very important martial application. Simply, it is faster to move your arms than your body. If you start a thrust with a step, your opponent can simply extend their arms to land a thrust. This naturally makes it very difficult for you to land your thrust, and in addition, it leaves you very open to a counter thrust. Once again, a more detailed explanation of this is outside the scope of this series. A third issue with making the thrust with your arms is that it makes it more difficult to actually hit your target. If your arms are moving around just before impact, it is more likely that your non-dominant hand moves the point offline. If you extend your arms first, you have more time to make that your point is actually pointing at your target. Another thing to think about is how deep should you thrust. The answer is rather simple. All the way through your target, but not further. When the thrust is deep enough for the point to come out on the other side of your target, the thrust has already done all the damage it will do. Yes, technically, if your sword widens considerably, it might still do a bit of an extra damage because of the widening of the wound. However, in my opinion, this is of a negligible benefit. With thick targets, such as thrusting to human torso from the side, I would recommend limiting the penetration to 15 to 20 centimeters. I would not think too deeply into this. For example, in my opinion, it is not useful to try to limit the penetration to the minimum required to hit a specific organ. Simply achieving something like that under stress and against a moving target would be extremely difficult. Just go for the good enough option. As an added benefit, this is an easy metric to check when thrusting against a cutting medium. If the point comes out on the other side of your target, you thrust deep enough. If it is poking out more than, let's say, 10 centimeters, you thrust too deep. I will not talk about retrieving the sword right now, as it has its own section. For now, it is enough to know that the sword should travel on the exact same line when you are stepping in as when you are stepping away from the target. This is naturally built into the exercises. That covers the very basic thrusting theory. Now, let's get to the first exercise, starting with our first starting position. Start by standing in a good fencing stance, dominant foot forwards. Have the sword fully extended in front of you, point at face height. While keeping the sword pointing at your imaginary opponent's face, bring your hands in front of your hips. Keep the sword centered. If you need to target the chest instead of the face, do the same thing. Simply start with the sword pointing at your imaginary opponent's chest instead of their face. Now let's get to the first exercise. You can do this either targeting the chest or the face. I recommend that you do both. In fact, you should learn to target anywhere between the hips and the face. Start with either the chest or the face, and after you can do that comfortably, start experimenting with thrust to different heights. In my example, I will be showing a thrust to the face. We will be gripping the sword while we extend our arms. As we need to bring our elbows closer to each other to extend our arms, this should feel rather natural. Remember to slightly extend your wrists to bring your forearms in line with the sword. Stand in the starting position with your sword pointing at your imaginary opponent's face. Extend your arms, moving the sword in a straight line. While extending your arms, grip the sword with a ringing motion. Take a simple advancing step to deliver the thrust. Make sure your point stays in line and the sword is centered. Stop. Keep your arms extended and take an advancing step backwards. Bring your arms back to return to the starting position. Repeat. You should start doing this exercise in 2 separate steps. First, extend your arms, stop for a moment, then step to deliver the thrust. The same goes when coming back. First, take a step back and then stop for a second. Then, bring your hands back close to your body. After you can do that consistently, start making the action smoother. First, try to remove the stop between extending your arms and stepping. Basically, extend your arms and as soon as they are fully extended, start the step. When coming back, start pulling your hands back as soon as the step is done. After that, you should try to make the action even smoother while still extending your arms first. Basically, while extending your arms, start to move your weight forwards. Basically, you can think of this as slightly leaning forwards. As soon as your arms are fully extended, your foot should come off the ground for this step. When coming backwards, you should start pulling your hands in as soon as your back foot touches the ground. After you can do this with your dominant foot forwards, learn to do it with your non-dominant foot forwards. There are 3 common issues with this exercise. The first is that your point is offline. In other words, you are missing with the thrust, or at least you are not hitting where you were aiming at. There are 2 basic reasons for this. The first one is that your non-dominant hand is moving around. The second one is that your arms are still extending when the thrust lands. Even the second issue is usually caused by the movement of the non-dominant hand. To fix this, start by extending your arms slowly while keeping the point in line throughout the whole movement. The second issue is that you step before you have extended your arms. Simply do not. You must first fully extend your arms, then step. Why this is an issue was explained earlier. The last issue is that while taking this step, you shift to the side, thus taking the point offline. When stepping, you need to be able to maintain your balance. This might be easier with a narrower stance. As you do not have sword wind to tell you when you are doing the drill correctly, you should try to do this against a solid target. That is, in addition to doing the exercise without a target. A wall target is very good for this exercise. Just remember to maintain proper structure so that the blade can bend. Different kinds of pelts are also excellent for this, especially as they tend to give in a little, thus giving you a better grasp on how deep you are thrusting. This is also one of the exercises which is perfect for partner drills. After you can comfortably do this with an advancing step, also learn to do a thrust with a passing step. The exercise is exactly the same as with an advancing step, you simply take a passing step both ways. You should also learn to do this with both feet forwards. With the passing step version, you must make sure that you do not turn your shoulder line. As you have to turn your hips to take a passing step, it is also easy to turn your shoulders. This will take the point offline. Make sure that your shoulder line does not turn during the step. Once again, take your time with the exercise and do not rush to the next one. In the next exercise, we will be doing the same thrust, but from a more common low guard. To get into the starting position, stand in a good fencing stand, dominant foot forwards. Have your arms and sword extended. Have the sword point at your imaginary opponent's face. Now bring your hands back next to your hip. To keep center, remember to turn your hips and shoulder line. Make sure that the point stays in line. We are once again going to do this exercise from both sides. I recommend that you start from your non-dominant side, as standing in the dominant side variant might not allow you to have a proper grip. As you need to cross your hands to bring them next to your hip, you might need to open your non-dominant hand to allow it. In this case, aim to form a proper grip as soon as possible when you start to extend your arms. Now to the exercise itself. Stand in the starting position with your sword pointing at your imaginary opponent's face. Extend your arms, moving the sword in a straight line. As you extend your arms, grip the sword with a ringing motion. Remember to turn your shoulders and hips to keep center. In the end position, the sword should be centered and the edges pointing straight up and down. Take a simple advancing step to deliver the thrust. Make sure your point stays in line and the sword is centered. Stop. Keep your arms extended and take an advancing step backwards. Bring your arms back to return to the starting position. Repeat. The major difference with this exercise when compared to the previous one is that you need to rotate your hips and shoulders while doing the thrust. Here are the most common issues with this exercise. If you do not rotate your hands correctly, you will end up with the point of line. Remember, to keep the point in line, you want to use your dominant hand for the motion. Also, if you do not rotate your hips and shoulders, you will end up leaving the center. As already said, remember to do this exercise with both the dominant and the non-dominant foot forwards. And as with the previous exercise, start slow and in 2 parts. After you get comfortable with that, start making the action smoother. And remember that pels and other targets are good for these exercises. With this exercise, you also want to learn to do it with a passing step. For more detailed explanation, please refer to the previous exercise. Now you know how to do a very basic thrust from a low guard. So let's take a look at how to do a basic thrust from a high guard. I will be going through this rather quickly as it's mostly the same as when thrusting from a low guard. The difference is that most people tend to find it harder to keep the point in line when thrusting from a high guard. Let's start with the starting position. Stand in a low thrust starting position. Now bring the sword next to your head so that the sword is roughly at forehead level and the cross is in front of your head. The movement to bring the sword up comes mainly from your elbows. The dominant side works just like the non-dominant side, with the exception that you need to have your arms crossed. As with the low guard on the dominant side, it is likely that you are not able to hold a proper grip on the sword with your non-dominant hand. Again, try to establish a proper grip on the sword as early as possible when extending your arms. Do the following exercise from both sides. I recommend starting from the non-dominant side as people tend to find it easier. Stand in the starting position with your sword pointing at your imaginary opponent's face. Extend your arms, moving the sword in a straight line. As you extend your arms, ring to grip the sword properly. Make sure your arms and wrists are straight. Take a simple advancing step to deliver the thrust. Make sure your point stays in line and the sword is centered. Stop. Keep your arms extended and take an advancing step backwards. Bring your arms back to return to the starting position. Repeat. The exercise is exactly the same from the other side. The only clear difference being that you naturally can't straighten your non-dominant arm, similarly to an end position of an ascending cut from the non-dominant side. This will make gripping by ringing very difficult if not impossible. You also need to start by establishing a proper hold on the grip with your non-dominant hand as soon as possible. In this position, it is harder to keep the point in line, so start slowly and concentrate on extending your arms. Do not forcefully try to bring the sword to the center line, that is, the line directly from you to your opponent. This will cause your wrists to bend to a structurally weak position. Instead, keep your hands slightly to the side, which allows you to have your wrist straight. Other than that, the exercise has the same issues as the previous one, so refer to that. Also, do this exercise with a passing step. Here it is important that you turn your hips as you step, but keep your shoulder line in place. If you turn your shoulder line with your hips as you step, it is basically impossible to keep the point in line. Other than that, there are no differences when compared to the previous exercise. We still have a single exercise left. In it, we will be changing between 2 guard positions while extending our arms. As explained in the blunt versus sharp section, this is important as it is almost impossible to turn the sword after the thrust has landed. With these exercises, you want to do them from both sides and with an advancing and passing steps. I will not go through these exercises step by step as they are identical to the previous ones with the exception of the part where you extend your arms. To keep this episode to a somewhat sensible length, I will only show the different extensions. After the extension, simply deliver the thrust with an advancing or a passing step. After that, step back and pull your hands back. But now, do the first variation. Stand in the starting position for a low thrust on either side. While you extend your arms, bring your hands up to the extended position of a high thrust on the same side. Remember that by controlling the sword, using your dominant hand allows you to keep the point in line. Stand in the starting position for a high thrust on either side. While you extend your arms, bring your hands down and to the center line as you would extend for a low thrust. Stand in the starting position for a low thrust on either side. While extending your arms, bring your hands up and to the opposite side to the extended position of a high thrust. It is important that you rotate your shoulder line enough to keep center. You probably need to rotate your hips to allow for your shoulders to rotate enough and keep a stable stance. Stand in the starting position for a high thrust on either side. While you extend your arms, bring your hands to the opposite side to the extended position of a high thrust. In this exercise, you need to make room for the pommel to pass your forearms. This requires you to bring your hands down as you come closer to the center line. This allows the pommel to pass under your forearms. Shoulder level or slightly lower should be enough depending a bit on your arm length and such. From there, bring your hands back up to the correct extended position. You basically draw a U shape with your hands during the motion. Remember to keep the sword pointing at the face of your imaginary opponent during the whole movement. It might be a good idea to practice this movement having your arms extended, like in the example you see right now, before you try to do it during the extension. As said earlier, do all of these exercises with a passing and an advancing step. And once more, remember that solid targets are very good for thrusting exercises. For more details on how to fix possible issues, please refer to the previous exercises. Now, let's see how to retrieve a sword from a target. The basic thrusting theory we just went through works just the same with a blunt as with a sharp. Now we get to the sharps only section. Basically, what happens when the sword penetrates into the target. At least I hope this never happens with a training sword, as it would mean that something has gone horribly wrong. Let's start the discussion with when you should actually try to retrieve the sword. As with many other things, there is no clear answer as there are too many variables. Is your target moving, and if it is, which way? Is your sword likely to be stuck anyways, and so on and so on. My generic answer is that if you are further than half the length of the blade inside your target, you are too far. At this point, the best bet is to try to run the target through or to abandon your sword. It might still be possible to get the sword out, for example if your target is moving away from you, and similarly, it is completely possible that the sword is stuck even though it's only 10 centimeters in. So for the very rough rule of thumb, if you are more than half the blade in, maybe try something else than retrieving your sword, but once again, you really just need to assess your situation. Now that we have a rough idea when to even try retrieving a sword, let's talk about what actually happens when the sword penetrates into the target. When the sword penetrates into the target, it needs to create space for it to move into. Naturally, the sword only creates space along the path it travels. It also has to spread open the material so that the blade can fit in. This has few very important implications. Firstly, as the sword has to spread the material to fit in, there is pressure on the sides of the blade. This naturally causes friction, which hinders the movement of the blade. This is just from the sword being in the target. Because of this is the absolutely smallest amount of resistance you have to overcome when retrieving this sword. The second thing is that because the sword only creates space along the trajectory it travels, if you try to remove the sword along any other trajectory, there is going to be extra resistance. Let's take a look at the different trajectory issues you might cause when trying to retrieve the sword. A thing people might not think of is that if you rotate the sword around a long axis, you are basically trying to wedge the hole open. This naturally causes more friction, making retrieving the sword more difficult. This is a very easy mistake to make, and it can easily make the sword stuck in the target. The same thing happens if the target rotates around the sword. For example, if it starts to topple over to one side. Here we start to see that it is not just what you do, but what your target does that can get your sword stuck. The next thing is that there is sideways motion to the direction of the flats. You can think of this as a sideways motion or as a rotation if you want. Generally speaking though, this is a rotation. You are once again trying to wedge the hole open, just in a different direction. In my experience, this is especially bad if your sword is flexible. Instead of actually wedging the hole open, the blade bends and makes retrieving it very difficult. Once again, the same thing can happen because your target rotates to the direction of the flats. In my opinion, this is the one movement from your target which can actually yank the sword out of your hands. If your target turns enough and does it fast enough, it is completely possible that you lose the hold on your sword. The last rotation we have left is to the direction of the edges. This is the smallest issue you might have, as the edges are sharp. Because of this, they can actually cut open the material as you are trying to retrieve the sword. Of course, this is still more difficult than not having the rotation in the first place. And once again, the same might be caused by the rotation of your target. If your target is falling away from you in this manner, it is actually likely that the sword extracts itself. All of these rotations make it more difficult to retrieve the sword. In most cases, especially with non-stationary targets, all of them are happening at the same time in smaller or larger amounts. Your job is to minimize the amount of each. In some cases, you simply can't do anything about them as your target is moving too much. This is one of the cases in which you might just want to abandon your sword and think of a backup plan. Now, how to retrieve a sword? In theory, this is very simple. Make sure you do not rotate the sword in any way and pull it out along exactly the same trajectory it went in. In practice, this is of course much more difficult than it might sound. If your target moves at all, you have to move to compensate, and just not rotating the sword in any way is difficult enough. But what you can actually do is what we have been doing in the exercises. After you have successfully thrust, keep your arms extended and retrieve the sword by taking a step backwards. As you are not using your arms to pull, it is easier to not rotate the sword. As you took a step forwards to deliver the thrust, taking a step backwards is the easiest way to mimic the trajectory. Even if you took a passing step to deliver the thrust, I would recommend that you take an advancing step backwards to retrieve the sword. This makes it easier to maintain the trajectory. If you do not manage to retrieve the sword by taking a step backwards, you can try then to use your arms to pull the sword out. My recommendation for this is to keep your wrists and elbows as loose as possible and rotate from the shoulders. Personally, I think of this as bringing my elbows backwards. The idea behind this is to allow your wrists and elbows to rotate freely so that there is as little force rotating the sword as possible. In a high guard, think about pulling your elbows back and up. In a low guard, think about pulling your elbows back and down. Generally, trying to twist and rotate the blade free is a bad idea. In the worst case, you might actually bend your sword. This is of course highly dependent on the steel and the blade geometry of the sword. The thing to remember is that if you have to try this, you are already doing something wrong. There are no specific exercises for retrieving the sword. You simply need to get your hands on the cutting media of your choice and perform the exercises explained previously with that. The best cutting media for this are tatami and clay. The worst ones are anything which is lightweight and or not solid, such as milk cartons, water bottles and so on. With these exercises and the basic theory, you should be able to perform relatively well with thrusts. Even though I think that you should use the majority of your cutting training to actually train cutting, do not completely neglect thrusting. Before we get to the recap, go and stab that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Always extend your arms first, then step. You want to deliver the thrust with a step. This allows you to drive the sword with your body weight. To retrieve a sword, you want to keep your arms extended and take a step backwards. This helps to limit any rotation which might get the sword stuck. Sometimes it is the best to run your target completely through or abandon your sword. Try to limit the penetration to maximum of 15 to 20 centimeters. Being able to retrieve the sword is not completely up to you, as the movement of your target can have a huge impact.